Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Cesatris, and this week I wanted to talk about historical fiction. So I've been talking a lot about science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, all those kinds of genres, but I don't often talk about historical fiction, and that's another genre that I really enjoy. And I haven't read a lot of it recently, and I really want to get back into it because there's just something about digging into the way an author sort of creates this sense of realism in historical settings that is just perfect. Now, historical fiction is a pretty broad category. There are quite a few kind of subsets within that. You know, Regency romance is a part of it, right up until crime fiction that's set in historical time periods. So there's a lot of subsets, and this list that I'm going to talk about my top 10 favorite historical fiction books, is going to be a little bit of everything. There's going to be lots of different kinds of genres, lots of different locales, all that kind of stuff. But historical fiction is definitely something that it kind of gets a bad rap sometimes because it's seen as slow or it's seen as boring. And you just have to kind of find the right author because there's lots of different kinds of genres within historical fiction. So it isn't just dry stories about people being sad during like World War I or whatever. There's lots of variation in there, and I'm going to hope to kind of paint a positive picture of this. Now, there are a few historical fiction books that are very popular that I wouldn't recommend, and I'm going to kind of touch on those. And then there's some that I haven't read yet that I really want to get into because they've had really good reviews. But these are ones that I have read and that I thoroughly enjoyed. So let's get into the list without any further ado. First up on the list is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And this is just an outstanding novel. This one kind of straddles the line between historical and literary. This kind of tells the story of a certain person living in an African village who encounters sort of colonizers for the first time, and the effect that has on the stability of the culture around him, and also of kind of his concept of sort of how the world works. The story at its heart of it is just a family drama and the internal struggle of a main character as he tries to live up to his family's sort of expectations. And then that story kind of gets derailed once the outsiders come in. And so it's like when it says things fall apart, the quote is taken from a Yeats poem, but it's really like not only is the culture falling apart because of the influence of these white outsiders, but you also get sort of the story itself sort of falls apart, and you yourself as a reader find yourself kind of lost as you're trying to make sense of kind of, wait, what's happening to the story now? So this is it's an outstandingly written book. It's part of a trilogy. I do have the other two books in the series, but I haven't read them yet, and I definitely want to get into that. But this book is a classic for a reason. It should be studied in schools. It's gripping. It's not too long. It's gripping. It's engaging. The characters are really vibrant and interesting, and it just pulls you right along. So would definitely recommend this one. Now, this next one's kind of a massive brick of a book, and that is James A. Michener's Hawaii. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I read this for the first time in high school, and I was taking like the bus to school, and I would read this, and it took me forever to get through it because this book is massive and like teeny tiny print. This basically tells the entire history of Hawaii. Like the first chapter is like the islands form out of the ocean because of volcanic activity, and then the final chapter I think is the modern day, which I think is like the 50s, 60s or so. But this book is just outstanding. It's massive in scope. It covers everything. Every chapter is sort of, it moves forward in time a little bit. And so you do have some characters from previous chapters who show up in later chapters as like much older. And then you have some characters who become like legendary figures that are talked about years and years later, even after they're gone. It's a really diverse cast. It doesn't just cover like the Hawaiian people. It covers like there's one whole section that follows like a Chinese family and the immigrants as they moved to Hawaii and set up their kind of community. You get incredible descriptions of like Hawaii during the war, and you get the whole thing about one of the most devastating sections is sort of there was a leper colony on Hawaii at one point, and so you get the characters as they relate to that, and it's the saddest thing in the universe. But I promise this book isn't depressing. It's epic in scope and very emotional, and so there's lots of highs and lows, but it's not just kind of relentlessly bleak. But you just get this incredible portrait of how much happened in this tiny little chain of islands, and the original people who lived there, the way they were treated, the way their culture was sort of suppressed to make room for all of the other cultures who kind of came in over time to sort of take over, because it's a very strategically important location. But just the characters in this one are so incredible. I read this years and years and years and years and years ago, and I still can remember favorite parts, and it's so good. So this is quite a commitment. If you can go through this in audio, I definitely recommend it if you're able to go through audio faster. I know I am. But this is definitely one that I would recommend. It's worth reading. It's huge and amazing. Love it. Next up is Amy Tan's The Valley of Amazement. This follows she's an American courtesan living in Shanghai in like the beginning of the 20th century, sort of the end of kind of the final sort of dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and the collapse and all the chaos that follows. And it follows her through the years. It spans like 40 years, and there's this whole thing about her and her connection to her mother and her concept of culture, because she is living in a culture that she doesn't really understand. She was sort of raised fairly Western, and I really, really enjoyed this one. Now, this one was, when it first came out, it was sort of dismissed a little bit. I think it was compared a lot to Memoirs of a Geisha, even though that one is set in Japan and this one's set in China, and they are fairly different. But the thing about Memoirs of a Geisha is that was written by a white guy who played a little fast and loose with the way that he kind of depicted the culture. It really wasn't his story to tell. And that's not to say that white authors can't tell historical stories set in other cultures, because there's some that do a great job, and I'm going to talk about a couple heading in this list here. But the thing with Memoirs of a Geisha is that a lot of people who are Japanese or who have Japanese heritage have said that the book just doesn't depict the culture very accurately, and it doesn't depict it very fairly. And so that book was the one that got all the attention, and it got a really good movie adaptation that I really like. The movie adaptation itself was controversial too, because they didn't hire very many Japanese actors to play the Japanese characters, which is a very dumb American thing to do. But that book was the one that kind of, you've got sort of courtesan living through many years and surviving and trying to make sense of her life amid turmoil. And this book was kind of considered to be sort of a cheap knockoff of that, but like set in China instead of Japan. But I really don't think so. Amy Tan really knows what she's doing. She handles the historical fiction with sensitivity and complexity, and there's nuance here, and she does a really good job of this story. And this one is incredible. I think a lot of her other ones are more contemporary. She does have some other historicals, but this is my favorite of her historical novels. It's just stunning and epic in scope, and wonderful, wonderful characters. Next up on the list is another big chunky one, and this is Sorum by Edward Rutherford. Edward Rutherford writes very similarly to James Michener, except he's English. And this is the same kind of book. It tells the entire history of the Salisbury Plain, which is where you get Stonehenge and the Salisbury Cathedral and all that. And it starts like prehistoric times. There's an early scene where it shows like Stonehenge being built. One thing with historical fiction is you don't ever want to read it as being like a textbook, like an actual history book, because there's always going to be artistic license taken with things, and there's often going to be historical events that were never written down or observed, or we don't have enough evidence, and so the author has to kind of make an educated guess to depict them in ways that sort of make the most sense. But this one is incredible. It goes through many, many years. Each chapter is sort of a different era in the history. And just like with Michener, you get some characters that are, we meet in later chapters as much older, and, events referenced in previous ones. We get to see how, we'll live the events with one character, and then years and years and years later, someone will be talking about the events that happened, and they're going to get it wrong because, history is always sort of muddled as it goes through the years. And so you kind of get this back and forth between historical events and then the historical record and public opinion about historical events. And but this one is really great. It is a little bit slower paced. Rutherford's writing is a little bit more contemplative and a little more, I don't know, it kind of has this sort of George Eliot kind of style prose, this sort of more old-fashioned meditative prose. And I really like his writing style, but some people might find this one a little bit slow. But I will say it's worth it. It's so satisfying to get through all this and to just see how everything links up. And this book is really, really wonderful. I really enjoyed this one. Next up on the list is, this one is called Witchlight by Susan Fletcher. Now this one was also published under different titles, I think in different countries. You might also see it being titled Corag, which is the name of the main character, or The Highland Witch, I think it's called in some other places. But this tells the story of the Glencoe massacre in Scotland, but it's from the point of view of kind of someone who isn't really involved in those events. This one's set in 1692, and it follows a young girl who sort of lives out on her own in the wilderness. She's got a little cabin, she's known as a witch, and she just sort of does her own thing, just sort of living in the wilderness in Scotland. And she's captured and put on trial for witchcraft, and we see kind of how she survives all of that. But in the background, you've got the Glencoe massacre and the betrayal of the English, and that's kind of happening in the background, so it's not the main focus, but you get such a beautiful portrait of these events and the relationship between the Scottish people and the English people and all the tension therein. And then you've also got sort of the cultural attitudes towards, women just living on their own. The main character is very much a free spirit, and she just kind of does her own thing, and she isn't hurting anyone, but there's this terror of sort of witchcraft and independent women, and all these stories kind of link together. But this one is wonderful. It's not very long. It's beautifully written, very elegant, very literary, and you just get this sort of gorgeous portrait of this girl sort of just living on her own in the wilderness with the trees and the animals and all this stuff happening in the background, and then she gets kind of caught up in it, and it's very emotional, but it's very, very good and beautifully written. Now, next up on the list is another James Michener book, because this is another one that I have to mention. This one's another big one, and that is The Covenant. And this one is the history of South Africa. It's another huge sweeping tale that, traverses many, 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 many hundreds of years. And this one is just incredibly written because he handles everything with a fairly good level of nuance. Usually older writers, they didn't depict the inhabitants of Africa very well. And he does a really good job of depicting them with sort of humanity and respect, which you didn't see a lot of other writers at this time. I think this one was written in the 70s. Maybe I'm crazy. Oh, this was written in 1980. So that's probably why it feels a little more modern. But when you've had a lot of authors in the 50s and 60s, their depictions of the African peoples was not good at all. And so he does a pretty good job. Now, of course, you get the Dutch who colonized South Africa. And so again, you get this sort of we follow them for a period. We also follow kind of the original inhabitants of the area, and there's this conflict sort of between them of these Dutch settlers who sort of just claim this land and says, well, this is ours and we just live here now. And then they go on to call themselves Africans, and they become very proud of this culture that they think that they sort of created there. But then there's also the people who already lived there, and it goes up through the years of apartheid and how that happened, and then it moves into kind of the modern day. But I think this is a really excellent book, and it does a good job of depicting how the systems were harmful, the systems of colonization were harmful, but the individual people, the characters, aren't all just mustache twirling two-dimensional monsters, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. He really portrays every character as very human and complex, and there's bad characters, there's good characters, there's lots of morally gray characters, and then there's many people who are just kind of caught in this colonial system that is so harmful and damaging, and a lot of them don't know how to even get out of it, even if they didn't want to. So I appreciate that he doesn't just set it up as everyone on this side is pure evil and everyone on this side is virtuous and perfect. He really gets at kind of the nuance and the humanity of all the characters, which I really liked. And this is another massive one, and again, teeny tiny text. It'll take you a while to get through this one, but it's very worth it. It's so good. There's one chapter where it's like one of the Voortrekkers who befriends like a hyena, and he becomes like his best friend, and they're just like exploring out in the wilderness with his dog. I guess hyenas aren't really dogs, but his pet hyena, and it's just one of the most wholesome things ever. So this is an incredible book. Would definitely recommend it. Please read it. Now, next up on the list is, this one's kind of in the middle of a series, but it's a series that you don't necessarily have to read strictly in order, because each book sort of looks at a different era, and that is People of the Sea by W. Michael Gear and Kathleen O'Neill Gear. The authors are both archaeologists, and they're also really good novelists, and each of these books follows a different sort of indigenous tribe in early days of them kind of living in the US. It spans thousands and thousands of years. The first book is called People of the Wolf, and that covers the people who journeyed across the land bridge into North America and moved down, and that's when you got mammoths and stuff. And then there's others that are much more recent. They take place in like the 1500s and all over North America. This one takes place in prehistoric California, and I really like this one. This one's a shorter one, but it has such a gripping story. There's this woman who's escaping this horrific man that she's married to, and she's escaping from him, and he is really dangerous, and he's chasing after her, and she has to kind of survive and stay alive and keep her kids alive while she's kind of fleeing from this guy who's coming after her. And this one's set in it's like 11,000 years ago, so there's still mammoths around, and you've also got like the short-faced bear who's terrifying, who's like a bear that isn't around anymore. But this one is just gripping. It's more of a thriller than anything, and it's very dark in parts, but I just really loved it. This whole series is good. It definitely gets into the religious beliefs of the people, and since a lot of that is sort of an unknown, a lot of it is sort of interpolated from the historical record, and so you get things like shamanism and animism and all that. And so there are parts of the series that feel like they maybe should be considered more fantasy, but it fits as a historical book as well. But the whole series is fantastic. Each one covers a different tribe and a different total location. The book after this one is also a big favorite of mine, and that's People of the Lakes. This one is huge. And this one is talking about kind of the people who first moved up into Canada around the Great Lakes area. It's like the first Canadians. But this one is kind of like a Lord of the Rings style epic quest And it also features one of the funniest characters in the whole series, who is just goofy. He's kind of a little bit strange, and he's just kind of very chaotic and out there. Very, very funny. But this one is also really great. Not all of them are this huge. Most of them are kind of more this size. But this one is also really, really great. If you want like just a standalone, you can read this kind of on its own without having read any of the others. But the whole series is great. And the fact that the main characters are both archaeologists really adds a lot, because they're able to make sure things are as accurate and as true to life as possible. And they're also really fun. One common theme in a lot of the books is sort of women escaping abusive relationships, and then also the conflict between different interpretations of different religious beliefs and all of that. So just, I would definitely recommend it, and they're worth it. They're a lot of fun. Now, the next one is a book that I only have in audio, and so I'm going to be showing the box set of the DVD BBC adaptation of it. But that is I, Claudius by Robert Graves, and there's two books. It's I, Claudius and Claudius the God are the two books, but they kind of tell one single story. The first one ends very much in a cliffhanger, and then the second one sort of continues on into that. And if you haven't seen the BBC adaptation of it, you should. It's marvelous. It's very 70s, and the whole thing looks like it was filmed on like a theater stage rather than like, you know, a film studio. It is a little hokey at times in terms of the visuals, but it doesn't matter because the acting is so good. This cast is insane. John Hurt is like the most terrifying Caligula ever. But the book follows basically the life of the man who becomes the Emperor Claudius. It starts shortly after the assassination of Julius Caesar. We've got Caesar Augustus on the throne, and then it goes up until Claudius's death, when he is assassinated. But these books are so gripping. It's kind of a cliche because there's so many sort of ancient Rome dramas. You've got HBO's Rome and, you know, Gladiator and all that stuff. But this is very much just a really gripping sort of drama of scheming and betrayal and underhanded dealings. And you've got Claudius, who is trying to be a good person. He's got a stammer, so he has trouble kind of speaking. And everyone thinks that he's just not going to live up to anything, and he sort of is able to survive all of the chaos of everything. And so this is a great book. The BBC adaptation is amazing too. I love it so much. But these books are really gripping, and if you can read them in audio form, the audiobooks are really excellent too. Next up is Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. This is definitely one of my favorite books by her. This tells the story of, it was a very high profile murder trial in 1843, and it's a true story. And it was a man and his housekeeper that were murdered, and this kind of follows the woman who may or may not have been involved. It's very literary in the way it approaches everything, because you've got kind of her telling the story of what happened, but you're not always sure if you can believe what she's saying. And it also deals with sort of different genres. There's poetry in here, and it's sort of it deals with kind of the weirdness of memory and guilt and what really constitutes someone being guilty. It's great. Really, really gripping. It's sort of set up as a inversion of sort of the murder mystery trope, where you've got someone trying to figure out what's happening. And in this case, you've got someone who they're interviewing the main suspect and trying to figure out if she's the one who actually did it or not, and you're not really ever sure. But this is such a gripping book. It's gorgeously written, and I recommend it to everyone because I love it so much. And then finally on this list, we've got Roots by Alex Haley. This is another really long family saga that covers many different generations, quite a bit of time. This was adapted very famously into it was like a PBS miniseries, I believe. That won like 1 million awards, and it was really, really good. But this book is excellent. Now, the book is sort of structured as if it's like the family history of the author himself, but I think it does work better to call it historical fiction, because there are some things that are sort of interpreted from the historical record. So this is very much true to the history of what happened to the people who were brought over from Africa and raised in enslavement, and what happened through all those years leading up to present day. And so it is structured as though it's sort of the true history of the author's family, but read it as historical fiction, because, you know, there's a couple parts, especially really early on, that seem to be sort of adapted from other stories and combined together to tell kind of one long narrative. So I'm not saying this is, you know, it's bad because it's not telling the absolute truth. It's a historical fiction book that sort of, it moves things around so that it can tell a complete seamless story, and its purpose is to show what it was like for the people who were stolen from their homeland, brought over to America, and then them and their them and their descendants were raised in slavery. And so this is such a gripping book. It's engaging. There's parts that are thrilling, and then there's other parts that are just depressing, and there's parts that are funny. Like, it really is sort of like this ultimate human drama, and really, really captivating. I really enjoyed this one. I devoured it pretty fast, and you should definitely read it. And if you don't want to read this one because it is kind of huge, you should definitely check out the miniseries adaptation. Now, that one kind of sanitizes things a little bit, because there's obviously stuff that they couldn't show on TV in the 70s, because this is pretty brutal at times. But that miniseries is very important in its own right, and it's definitely worth watching. But, you know, definitely read this, because it's epic and incredible, and it really paints a very compelling portrait of sort of what it was like to slowly lose touch with your culture, and then have to sort of create a new cultural identity when you weren't allowed to do that. So definitely would recommend this one. This book is incredible. Now, I think in terms of books that I want to read that are historical fiction, the next one that I'm going to tackle is going to be Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth. I found this at a used bookstore years ago, and I've heard nothing but incredible things about this, so I am so excited to dive into it. But I think I'll do this one maybe in the winter or in the summer, because right now I'm kind of into like everything gothic and horror and everything. But historical fiction is great. I love just kind of losing myself in another time and place, and the characters and the cultures and everything. So there's so much that you can get from historical fiction, and there's so many great authors out there, and I will never catch up with all of them, and that makes me sad, because I want to read everything. But with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.